What's up and welcome to KplusGaming Corner, and in this Remnant 2 video, I got a 2-for-1 special going. 2 variations on the same build setup, some real fun ways to play the new Invoker class. Both are great when it comes to damage output and damage reduction, plus we're getting some extra movement speed, which will have you flying around the battlefield like a superhero. So if you were looking for some ideas on different ways to take advantage of the Invoker class, then you came to the right place. Without wasting any more time, let's get right into it. Starting with the archetype classes, we're using the Invoker as our main and the Challenger class as our secondary. The Visionary Prime perk is going to come in real handy since it doubles the base skill charges for all classes, plus activating any skills reduces all skill cooldowns by 10%. The gifted trait we get from the Invoker is also going to be helpful since it extends our skill duration by 30%. And for the skills, we're using Way of Lydusa with the Invoker and the Juggernaut skill for the Challenger. You could also go with the Way of Kayula skill for the Invoker. That's actually one of my favorite overall skills in the game due to its versatility and damage output, but I chose Way of Lydusa because we want to take advantage of the brittle status effect we can inflict on enemies, causing them to take on an extra 10% crit chance and 15% crit damage. The Entranced damage perk is increasing elemental damage by 15% and elemental crit chance by 5%, and the Mind and Body utility perk is increasing movement speed by 5% as well as damage reduction by 5% while an Invoker skill is active, and you can further extend the Invoker skill duration whenever you use one of your relics. Damage reduction is going to be important for this build, which is why I'm using the Juggernaut skill. I'll explain more about that when I get to the rings we're using. The Challenger Close Quarters damage perk is increasing all damage by 35% to enemies within 10 meters, which is pretty much all the time, plus we're getting another 5% crit chance, and with the Face of Danger relic perk, using a relic near enemies is increasing damage by another 10%, and we're getting 2 stacks of bulwark, so that's more damage reduction that we have access to. For the amulets, in the first version of this build, I'm using the Gift of the Unbound, which disables any negative effects from those burden rings. I used to like the idea of it, but I didn't really like the idea of losing some of my maximum health. That's been changed now since the new DLC. We're no longer punished for using it, but instead we're gaining 5% movement speed for each burden ring we're using, so up to 20% movement speed if you have burden rings in all 4 slots. I can't say enough about how much potential this amulet has now once you start mixing and matching those burden rings. Let me know in the comments what you think of this change and if it's something you've been using or thinking about switching to. For the rings, I'm going with the Burden of the Gambler, so we're increasing crit chance by 10% and crit damage by 15%, and we no longer have to sacrifice weak spot hits. And I'm using the new Burden of the Mesmer, which is increasing all damage by 1% for every 5% of our total damage reduction. Since we're sitting at a 61% damage reduction baseline, that's an extra 12% increase in our damage, and once I hit the Juggernaut skill, that jumps up to 68% damage reduction with more stacks of bulwark, and we can get that even higher if we use a relic near enemies while Juggernaut is active, giving us even more increase to all damage. For the 4th ring, I'm using the Dried Clay ring for another stack of bulwark, plus this ring is also amplifying all damage dealt by 50% of the total damage reduction you're getting from your bulwark stacks. For the relic, I'm still using the Profane Heart for the lifesteal bonus, and then I have some extra elemental damage, more damage reduction, and skill duration as the relic fragments. When it comes to the Profane Heart, it's often so effective you rarely find yourself needing it for healing purposes, but instead would more likely be using it to trigger your relic class perks, and since that's the case, that leads me to the 2nd variation of how you can run this build. In the next setup, instead of going with the Gift of the Unbound and using the burden rings, we're going with the Cost of Betrayal instead, which reduces your relic use charges down to 1, but you're also gaining a 25% increase to all damage, which is a lot. As mentioned, the way the Profane Heart works, you won't really need to heal yourself in the traditional sense, since it's only increasing the lifesteal efficacy you're already getting. But if you do need to use your relic, just keep in mind you'll be increasing all incoming damage to yourself by 25% for 15 seconds, and then you'll regain your relic charge. We're still using the Dried Clay ring and Burden of the Mesmer to increase our damage output based on our damage reduction, but since we're not using Gift of the Unbound, we're losing out on 20% of our maximum health, so you might want to chug on some concoctions like Mudtooth's Tonic or Dark Cider to balance things out. The other rings I'm using in this setup are the Floodlit Diamond for some extra weak spot damage. We can get up to 24% extra damage on those weak spot hits against exposed enemies, which we can get naturally with our weapons. I'll explain explain in a moment. And then I'm using the Token of Favor, which increases all damage dealt by 5% in addition to gaining another 10% crit chance against those exposed enemies. This brings us to our weapons, and as I was just saying about the exposed status we can inflict on enemies, we're getting that through the Monolith Long Gun, the reward for beating the Forgotten Kingdom DLC the regular way by killing Lydusa, already one of the best guns in the game period. This one shoots a steady beam of sand with a generous magazine size, and both the primary fire of this weapon and the attached Sandstorm mod will apply the exposed status onto enemies. Exposed enemies are taking on an extra 15% additional damage from all sources, plus the bonus from the rings that I mentioned, so this gun is rounding out both versions of this build very nicely. I'm using the tech pistol as the handgun at the moment, but that's flexible and up to you. Just keep in mind you'll want one that comes with decent crit chance, so the MP60R or the bolt driver could also be decent options here. I have the corrosive rounds as the mod here, which also increases ranged crit chance by 15%, and the corroded status you're applying is increasing the damage you can deal to those enemies, so it's a great tool to have in your back pocket if you need it. For the mutators, I'm using 1000 cuts on the Monolith. With this you can stack up to 25% extra crit chance and damage, plus it gives a nice reload speed bonus at max level. And then I have momentum on the handgun, which is also great for maximizing crit hit potential. As usual, the traits you go with are pretty flexible. Since we're using the Profane Heart and depending on lifesteal for healing, it's probably a good idea to spec into both Leech and Siphoner, and the Amplitude trait is going to help your Sandstorm mod cover a wider area and be more effective. So there you have it, that's the build. 2 for the price of 1. Really 2 different ways you can play the same build, both extremely effective against enemy mobs as well as bosses, and is an effective combo of both offense and defense, so your time on Apocalypse difficulty will be relatively stress-free. Let me know down below if you're running anything similar and how you have yours set up, or if you have any questions on where to find some of the rings, amulets, or mutators that I mentioned. Thanks so much for watching if you made it this far, and give this video a like and a thumbs up if you haven't already. And if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please consider subscribing and ringing those notification bells to make sure you're getting all the updates on when I'm going live or dropping new videos. Love you guys, and thanks again for all your support. I'll catch y'all on the next one. Until then, peace!